Hey, welcome back to our study called More Than You Can Think, and we're talking today about Genesis chapter 17, verses 17 through 18. I called this the struggle of faith because this is what we're seeing here. The first thing we look at is Abraham laughs. All right? In response to God's announcement that Sarah is going to give birth is really for Abraham to fall on his face and begin to laugh. Now, what kind of laughter is this? Because it's important. There's lots of different kinds of laughter, right? So what kind of laughter is this? This is not a laugh of mockery or scoffing. It's not laughter that comes from a hard heart. Or in the book of Romans, Paul makes it clear that this heart of Abraham is not a rebellious heart. He's not laughing because he's rebelling against God. Like laughing in God's face, like, yeah, right, you can't do this. Get out of here. He doesn't say that to God. No, he's got a different laugh. His faith is not weakening, and no unbelief is making him waver considering God's promises. He was fully convinced God was able to do what he has promised. So Abraham's struggle of faith is not that God can do all things, but that he would do all things, or how would he do all things, or the way he's going to do it. That's the thing that's blowing his mind. Like, God, you really want to do this, and you want to do it this way? Whatever. That is crazy. So that's kind of where Abraham is coming from. Not that he doesn't doubt that God is going to do that. He doesn't doubt the promise of God either. That's not where his faith is wavering. His faith is wavering on the other side of where, like, God is choosing Sarah. Like, why would you do that? That's okay, whatever. So he believes God, but his laughter betrays his small view of God. His faith has got to grow and continue to expand. That's what Abraham needs. That's why God keeps coming back to him, reassuring his faith. He's following an infinite God. Unless his comprehension of God has reached an infinite state, it still has to grow. Right? So his faith is, you have God who is infinite, and his faith is growing, and God is infinite, so he'll never come to the end of God. So the only way to actually learn about God, the only way to know God, is for you to continue to grow in your knowledge of him. Because if he is infinite, that means you can't come to the end of God. You can't come to the end of learning who God is, what he's about, what he thinks. You can never come to that end. And so it always has to be growing. Your faith in him and your knowledge of him has to keep growing no matter what. So, you know what? As humans, we'll never come to the end. We'll never fully comprehend God. Even in eternity, when you're in heaven, when you're in the presence of God, you'll never fully comprehend him because he's infinite. He's infinite. So, our view of God is always going to be small, but sometimes it's way too small. It needs to keep growing. It needs to get bigger. But why is Abraham's view of God small here? What's happened to cause them to have this small view of God right now? Well, we see that because Abraham points over to Ishmael. Abraham has conceived of his own ideas of God's plan, which is often what we do. Abraham points to Ishmael and says to God, I hear what you're saying. I hear about Sarah, and I understand that, but I already have Ishmael. Why not use him? For the last 13 years, Abraham has grown comfortable with God. He's assumed that God would just use Ishmael to fulfill the promises. Abraham had thought he figured out God's plan. And he assumed his plans were the same as God's. How quickly we do this. We're quick to substitute our small plans of God for really God's plans, which is an unbelievable, amazing plan. Something that goes beyond anything you could imagine. Remember that back in chapter 15? Abraham has already tried to do this before. He thinks he's getting God's plan figured out, and he says, well, he's telling me I'm going to have all these descendants. Well, the only guy I have here is Eliezer of Damascus. He'll be my heir. So if you're telling me I'm going to have all these descendants and all that, well, really, my stuff's going to go to this guy. And God says, no, that's not what's going to happen. You're not going to pass, your heir is not going to be Eliezer. It's going to be a child of yourself. And then now you get the whole explanation where it's not even going to be Ishmael, it's going to be Isaac. So we see that sometimes we do this too with what Abraham's doing is that, he's thinking about God's plan. God has told him what the promises are. And he's saying, okay, well, here's how God's going to figure this out. Here's how God's going to do this. And we replace or try to place our plan of God on God's real plan and say, well, this is how God's going to do it. But usually that's not how it works, because we don't know what God's going to do. God's plan is way beyond our imaginations. And so when we think that we got God's plan figured out, we're in the wrong place. We just need to say, hey, you know what? I don't know what God's plan is. Whatever it is, it's going to be amazing. And I'll just go with that. So we need to learn from Abraham's lesson here. And to not think we have it figured out, but just to listen for God's plan. Look at God's plan in Scripture. Look at God's promises in Scripture. And then wait for God to fulfill what He said He's going to do. And not try to figure it out all the time. We can figure out some things because He's told us some things. But for the things He hasn't, we just need to wait on Him. So that's the lesson we need to learn from this section.